would make a captive woman run straight into a raging fire, risking her life for a child who isn't even seen by his own people? This story begins with one impossible choice, and everything that follows will surprise you. Thank you so much for watching, and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Texas plains stretched endlessly under the scorching afternoon sun of 1873, waves of heat rising from the parched earth like invisible flames. Sarah Mitchell had been a captive of the Comanche band for 3 weeks now, ever since the raid on her family's homestead near the Brazos River. Her hands were raw from grinding corn and scraping hides, her face weathered by the relentless sun, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had learned quickly that survival meant observation, patience, and quiet compliance. The Comanche camp consisted of nearly 40 lodges arranged in a circular pattern, with the chief's teepee positioned prominently at the center. Sarah had been assigned to work alongside the other women, mainly gathering firewood, preparing meals, and tending to various camp duties. The warriors largely ignored her presence, viewing her as merely another resource acquired through their raids. The women treated her with cold indifference, neither hostile nor kind, simply expecting her to perform her assigned tasks without complaint. Chief Takota, whose name meant friend to all in the Comanche tongue, was a man of approximately 40 summers, with deep-set eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless battles and difficult decisions. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by a prominent scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. He commanded respect through his wisdom, and measured judgment rather than through cruelty or fear. Sarah had observed him from a distance, noting how he settled disputes among his people with patience, and how he spent considerable time in his lodge caring for someone she had not yet seen. It was during her 4th week in captivity that Sarah first learned about the chief's son. She had been collecting water from the nearby creek when she overheard 2 Comanche women speaking in hushed tones. Though her understanding of their language was limited, she caught enough words to piece together a tragic story. The chief's son, named Napawat, meaning strong and fearless, had been thrown from his horse during a buffalo hunt 2 seasons ago. The fall had left him unable to walk, his legs twisted and useless. For a Comanche warrior in training, such an injury was considered worse than death itself. The women spoke of how the boy, barely 14 summers old, had withdrawn into himself, refusing to leave his father's lodge, refusing to eat most days, his once bright eyes now dimmed with hopelessness. The chief had consulted medicine men from neighboring bands, had performed countless rituals, and had even traded precious horses for remedies from Mexican traders, but nothing had restored function to his son's legs. The tragedy had left Takota a changed man, less present in tribal councils, more withdrawn, carrying a burden of grief that seemed to age him beyond his years. Sarah found herself unexpectedly moved by this information. Despite being a prisoner among these people who had destroyed her previous life, she could not help but feel compassion for a father's suffering and a young boy's shattered dreams. Her own father had been killed during the raid, and her mother had died 2 years prior from fever. She understood loss intimately. She understood the particular pain of watching someone you love suffer without being able to help them. That evening, as purple and orange streaked across the western sky, Sarah noticed unusual activity in the camp. Women were preparing a large communal meal, and warriors were gathering wood for a substantial fire. She learned from gestures and broken words that they were celebrating the successful return of a hunting party that had brought down several buffalo. The meat would feed the band through the coming weeks, and such success warranted celebration. As darkness fell, the fire grew into a towering blaze, crackling and spitting embers into the night sky. Drums began their rhythmic beating, and warriors danced in traditional patterns, their movements telling stories of the hunt and of ancient victories. Children ran between the lodges, laughing and playing games. Even the normally stoic women seemed more relaxed, sharing food and conversation around smaller fires. Sarah sat at the periphery of the celebration, as was expected of her station. She had been given a small portion of roasted buffalo meat and some cornmeal cakes. The food was simple but welcome after a long day of labor. She watched the dancing flames, thinking about her former life, about the small cabin she had called home, about her father's laugh and her mother's gentle hands. Tears threatened to fall, but she blinked them back. Crying would accomplish nothing. Survival required strength, required presence of mind, required constant awareness. It was then that she noticed something unusual. A small figure emerged from the chief's lodge, dragging himself forward using only his arms. The boy's legs trailed uselessly behind him as he pulled his body across the rough ground with determination that seemed both admirable and heartbreaking. No one seemed to notice him. The celebration continued around him as if he were invisible. Sarah watched as young Napawat made his agonizingly slow progress toward the fire, perhaps drawn by the warmth, perhaps by a desperate desire to feel part of his community again, to remember what it felt like to be whole. She observed how the other children ran past him without acknowledgement, how the adults' eyes seemed to slide over him, as if he were not there. In Comanche culture, she had learned, a warrior who could not ride, could not hunt, could not fight, was considered already dead. The boy was a ghost among his own people, invisible in his brokenness. Her heart ached watching his struggle, watching how hard he fought for every foot of progress, watching the determination etched on his young face despite the obvious pain the movement caused him. Napawat had managed to reach a position perhaps 20 feet from the main fire when it happened. A dancer, lost in the rhythm and the story his movements told, stumbled backward. His foot caught on a piece of wood protruding from the fire, sending it flying through the air in a spray of sparks. The burning log landed directly on the dry grass near the chief's lodge, and within seconds, flames began spreading across the brittle vegetation. The wind, which had been gentle all evening, suddenly gusted stronger, as if nature itself had conspired in this disaster. The flames raced toward the nearest tipi with terrifying speed. Women screamed and grabbed children, pulling them away from the danger. Warriors shouted orders, organizing efforts to beat back the flames with blankets and hides. In the chaos and confusion, in the smoke and panic, no one noticed the crippled boy who lay directly in the path of the spreading fire. No one except Sarah. She saw Napawat trying desperately to drag himself away from the approaching flames, but his arms, already exhausted from pulling himself to the celebration, could not move him fast enough. His face showed not just fear but a terrible resignation, as if he had already accepted this as his fate, as if part of him welcomed an end to his suffering. The fire crept closer, consuming dry grass with a sound like rushing water, filling the air with choking smoke. Sarah did not think. There was no time for thought, no time for calculation of risk or consequence. She simply moved. Her legs carried her forward before her mind could raise objections about what might happen to a captive who drew attention to herself, about whether saving the chief's son might be seen as overstepping her position, about whether anyone would even care if the boy lived or died. She ran directly into the path of the flames, feeling the heat against her face like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. The smoke burned her lungs and made her eyes water, but she could see Napawat clearly enough. He looked up at her with wide eyes, shocked that anyone had noticed him, shocked that anyone would risk themselves for someone the tribe had already written off as dead. Sarah reached down and grabbed the boy under his arms. He was lighter than she expected, malnutrition from his depression having stripped away muscle and weight. She pulled him backward, away from the flames, using strength she did not know she possessed. Her feet slipped on the grass and she nearly fell, but she caught herself and kept moving. Kept pulling, kept fighting against the smoke and heat. The flames were so close now that she could feel her skin beginning to blister. The hem of her dress caught fire, small flames licking at the fabric. She stumbled, dragging the boy, ignoring the pain, focusing only on putting distance between them and the inferno. Her arms screamed in protest. Her back felt like it might break, but she refused to stop, refused to let go, refused to abandon this child to the flames. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been seconds, they were clear. Sarah collapsed onto the ground, still holding Napawat, both of them coughing and gasping for breath. She beat out the flames on her dress with her bare hands, barely noticing the burns. The boy lay in her arms, looking up at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and confusion and wonder. It was only then that she looked up and saw Chief Takota standing before her, his face illuminated by the still raging fire behind him. His expression was completely unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Around him, other members of the tribe had stopped their firefighting efforts to stare at the scene before them. The white captive woman holding the chief's crippled son, both covered in soot and ash, both alive when they should have been consumed by flames. The chief's gaze moved from Sarah to his son, then back to Sarah again. He looked at the scene around him, at his people who had been so focused on saving property and provisions that they had not noticed a child in mortal danger. His jaw tightened, and something like anger flashed in his eyes, though Sarah could not tell if it was directed at her, at his people, or at the situation itself. Behind them, the warriors had finally managed to contain the fire. The chief's lodge had been damaged but not destroyed. Several other tipis had sustained minor burns, but the worst had been prevented. Yet Dakota did not turn to assess the damage. His eyes remained fixed on the white woman who cradled his son, the woman who had done what none of his own people had thought to do. Napawat spoke then, his voice weak and hoarse from smoke, but clear enough to be heard. He spoke in Comanche, words that Sarah did not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. He was defending her, explaining what had happened, telling his father that she had saved his life when no one else had even tried. The boy's hands gripped Sarah's arm, as if afraid she might disappear, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself unstable and uncaring. Chief Dakota's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he listened to his son. He nodded slowly, then spoke a single word, sharp and commanding. Two women hurried forward, and he gestured for them to help Sarah to her feet. They did so gently, supporting her weight as her legs trembled with exhaustion and delayed shock. Another woman carefully lifted Napawat, cradling him as she would an infant, carrying him back toward what remained of the chief's lodge. The chief stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his dark eyes. He spoke to her in Comanche, his voice low and measured. She did not understand the words, but she understood the gravity in his tone, understood that something significant had shifted in this moment. He placed his hand over his heart, then gestured toward her, a gesture that seemed to carry weight and meaning beyond simple acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked toward his lodge, following the woman who carried his son. The crowd began to disperse, returning to the work of assessing damage and securing the camp for the night. But Sarah could feel their eyes on her, could sense that something had changed in how they perceived her. She was no longer just a captive, just another piece of property. She had become something else, something undefined, something that would need to be determined in the days to come. As Sarah was led to the small shelter where she slept, her mind raced with questions and fears and a strange, unexpected hope. She had acted on instinct, on compassion, on a human response to seeing another human in danger. She had not considered consequences or calculations. She had simply done what felt right in that moment. And now, as she lay down on her simple bedding, feeling the pain of her burns beginning to assert itself, she wondered what her impulsive act of mercy might mean for her future among these people. Outside, the camp slowly settled into an uneasy quiet. The celebration was forgotten, replaced by the serious work of recovery and repair. But in the chief's lodge, Dakota sat beside his son, watching the boy sleep, thinking about the white woman who had valued his son's life more than her own safety, more than any of his own people had. And in that thinking, seeds of change began to take root in his heart, seeds that would grow into something neither he nor Sarah could yet imagine. Morning came to the Comanche camp with the soft golden light that was characteristic of Texas autumn, the air carrying a slight chill that would burn away by midday. Sarah woke to find a woman standing at the entrance of her shelter, holding a clay bowl filled with a fragrant salve. The woman, older than Sarah by perhaps 15 years, had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She gestured for Sarah to show her hands and arms, where burns from the previous night's fire had left angry red marks. The woman worked in silence, applying the salve with gentle, practiced movements. The medicine was cool against Sarah's burned skin, bringing immediate relief from the stinging pain that had kept her awake through much of the night. When she finished, the woman spoke a single word that sounded like piaru, which Sarah would later learn meant good or kind. Then she left, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her confusion about what this gesture of care might signify. An hour later, a young warrior appeared at her shelter. He was perhaps 18 or 19, with a serious face and proud bearing. He made gestures indicating that Sarah should follow him, so she did, her heart beating faster with uncertainty about where she was being taken. They walked through the camp, past women preparing morning meals and children already beginning their daily games, until they reached the chief's lodge. The damage from last night's fire was evident in the scorched earth and burned patches on the hide covering, but the structure still stood. The young warrior held aside the entrance flap and indicated that Sarah should enter. She hesitated, every instinct warning her about the vulnerability of entering the chief's private space, but refusal seemed impossible. She ducked through the opening into the dim interior. The lodge was larger than she expected, perhaps 20 feet across, with a fire pit in the center, where a small, smokeless fire burned. Buffalo robes and woven blankets lined the floor, and various belongings hung from the lodge poles, including weapons, medicine bundles, and what appeared to be items of ceremonial significance. Chief Takota sat on the far side of the fire, and beside him, propped up on folded blankets, was Napawat. The boy's face brightened when he saw Sarah enter. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, gesturing toward her with obvious excitement. The chief raised his hand and the boy fell silent, though his eyes remained fixed on Sarah, with an expression of gratitude and something that looked almost like hope. Takota studied Sarah for a long moment, his face as unreadable as it had been the night before. Then he began to speak slowly and carefully, using simple words and accompanying them with gestures. His meaning gradually became clear. He was thanking her for saving his son. He was acknowledging that she had done what none of his people had done, and he was offering her a change in status within the tribe. She would no longer be assigned to the hardest labor. She would be permitted to move more freely through the camp, and most significantly, she would be allowed to spend time with Napawat, to keep him company, to help care for him. The chief's expression as he made this last point carried a weight of sadness that transcended language barriers. Sarah understood that he was entrusting her with something precious, something he himself had been unable to protect or heal. Sarah nodded her acceptance, and something that might have been relief flickered across Takota's face. He spoke to his son in their language, and Napawat responded with enthusiasm that seemed to energize his entire being. The chief rose and gestured for Sarah to take his place beside the boy. Then he exited the lodge, leaving them alone. For a moment, neither Sarah nor Napawat spoke. She looked at the boy more closely now than she had been able to the night before. He had his father's strong features, though still softened by youth. His dark hair was long and well kept, and his eyes held an intelligence and awareness that seemed beyond his years. The suffering he had endured had marked him, but it had not broken him entirely. Something resilient remained in those eyes, something that still hoped despite all evidence that hope was foolish. Napawat began to speak, pointing at objects around the lodge and saying their names in Comanche. Sarah realized he was teaching her, giving her the words for fire, blanket, water, food. She repeated each word carefully, trying to match his pronunciation. When she succeeded, his face would light up with approval. When she struggled, he would patiently repeat the word until she got it right. They continued this way for some time, building a basic vocabulary that would allow them to communicate. As they worked, Sarah found herself drawn to the boy's determination and intelligence. Despite his physical limitations, despite the way his own people had written him off, despite the pain she could see in his eyes when he looked at his useless legs, he engaged with the lesson with focus and purpose. He was teaching her his language, yes, but she sensed he was also teaching himself, that he still had value, that he could still contribute something meaningful. The days began to form a pattern. Sarah would wake, tend to her assigned morning tasks, then spend most of the day with Napawat in the chief's lodge. The boy proved to be an excellent teacher, and Sarah's understanding of the Comanche language grew rapidly. As she learned to communicate more effectively, she began to understand more about the culture, the values, the way of life that defined these people. Napawat told her about his life before the accident, about learning to ride almost before he could walk, about his first successful hunt, about the plans he had made for his future as a warrior. He spoke about the accident itself, how his horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole at full gallop, how he had been thrown with tremendous force, how he had felt something break inside him when he hit the ground. He described waking up unable to feel his legs, unable to move them no matter how hard he concentrated. He talked about the medicine men who had tried to heal him, about the ceremonies and prayers and remedies that had all failed. He spoke about watching his friends continue their training while he remained trapped in the lodge, about hearing stories of their growing skills and accomplishments while he could contribute nothing. And he confessed, in a voice barely above a whisper, about the times he had wished the accident had simply killed him, about how being alive but useless felt worse than death. Sarah listened to all of this with a growing ache in her chest. She recognized the depth of his suffering because she had experienced her own losses, her own moments of wishing for an end to pain. But she also saw something that Napawat could not see himself. She saw strength in how he had survived this long despite his despair. She saw intelligence in how quickly he adapted to teaching her. She saw value that had nothing to do with his ability to ride or hunt or fight. She began to tell him this, using her improving Comanche and supplementing with gestures when words failed her. She told him about her own losses, about her father's death and her mother's illness, about the grief that had sometimes felt like it would consume her entirely. She told him that surviving pain was its own kind of strength, that continuing to live when you wanted to die required courage that warriors on the battlefield might never know. Napawat listened to her words with an intensity that suggested he was hearing something he desperately needed to hear, even if he was not yet ready to believe it. His eyes would meet hers, and in those moments, Sarah felt a connection forming between them, a recognition of shared pain and shared resilience. They were both survivors of different kinds of disasters, both struggling to find meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to crush hope. Chief Takota observed these developing interactions with careful attention. He would enter the lodge in the evenings and find his son more animated than he had been in months, talking and even occasionally laughing. The change in Napawat was subtle, but unmistakable. The boy who had been withdrawing into darkness was slowly, tentatively, reaching back toward the light. One evening after Sarah had returned to her own shelter, Takota sat with his son and asked him directly about the white woman. Napawat spoke with passion about how she listened to him, how she saw him as a person rather than as a broken thing to be pitied or ignored. He talked about how she understood suffering in a way that others did not, how her words made him think differently about his situation. The chief listened to all of this, and a plan began forming in his mind. His son needed purpose, needed to feel valuable again, and this woman who had shown such courage and compassion deserved better than the life of a captive. Perhaps there was a way to address both needs simultaneously, to create something good from tragedy and loss. But such a plan would require time, would require careful consideration of tribal customs and politics, would require wisdom and patience. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about Napawat during her hours away from the chief's lodge. She thought about his intelligence and his determination, about the person he had been before the accident and the person he might still become. She found herself wanting to help him not out of obligation or fear, but out of genuine care for his well-being. This realization troubled her, because caring about her captors complicated her situation in ways she did not fully understand. As the weeks passed, the weather began to shift toward winter. The mornings grew colder, and the band began preparations for the harder months ahead. Hunting parties went out more frequently, bringing back deer and elk to be dried and preserved. Women worked long hours preparing hides and repairing lodges against the coming cold. The entire camp buzzed with purposeful activity. It was during this time that Takota began spending more time in his lodge when Sarah was there with Napawat. He would work on repairing weapons or crafting new arrows, his presence a quiet third party to their language lessons and conversations. Sarah noticed that he listened carefully to their discussions, occasionally offering a word or clarification when she struggled with a particular concept. She also noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was focused on his son. It was not the look of a man viewing property or a captive. It was something more complex, more thoughtful. It made her nervous and confused, because she could not read the intention behind those glances. Was he reassessing her value to the tribe? Was he concerned about her influence on his son? Was there something else entirely happening that she lacked the cultural knowledge to interpret? One afternoon, when Napawat had fallen asleep during their lesson, exhausted from the effort of concentration, Takota gestured for Sarah to follow him outside. Her heart raced with uncertainty as she complied, following him away from the lodge to a quiet area at the edge of camp, where they could speak without being overheard. The chief stood for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, it was in careful, measured Comanche, speaking slowly enough that she could follow his meaning. He told her that he had been watching how she interacted with his son, how she had brought light back into the boy's eyes. He said that Napawat smiled again, spoke again, engaged with life again, all because of her presence and her care. Then Takota said something that shocked Sarah to her core. He said that he had been a poor father since the accident, that his grief over his son's condition had blinded him to what the boy truly needed. He had been so focused on trying to fix Napawat's legs that he had forgotten to see his son's heart, his mind, his spirit. She had reminded him, through her actions, what it meant to truly see another person, to value them for who they were, rather than what they could do. Sarah stood speechless, unable to fully process the vulnerability and honesty in the chief's words. This powerful leader, this man who commanded the respect and obedience of his entire band, was admitting failure to her, a white captive woman. It was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she thought she understood about her position and his authority, that she could not formulate a response. Takota continued, explaining that he wanted to offer her formal adoption into the tribe. She would no longer be a captive, but a member of the band with all the rights and protections that entailed. She would be declared the sister of his late wife, making her Napawat's aunt by Comanche law, giving her an official role in the boy's life and care. It was an extraordinary offer, one that would completely transform her status and her future. But Sarah understood enough about Comanche culture by now to know that such an adoption carried obligations as well as benefits. She would be expected to fully embrace their way of life, to leave behind her white identity, to become truly one of them. She would be expected to marry eventually, likely to whomever the chief deemed appropriate. She would be bound to this band for the rest of her life, with no possibility of returning to the white world she had known. The choice before her was stark and clear. Accept the offer and gain safety, status, and the opportunity to continue helping Napawat, or refuse and remain a captive with no real future, vulnerable to whatever fate the tribe decided for her. Yet it did not feel like a simple calculation of advantage. Something deeper was at stake, something about identity and belonging, and the fundamental question of who she was and who she wanted to become. Sarah requested time to consider the chief's offer, and Takota granted it with a solemn nod. That night, as she lay in her shelter listening to the wind whistle across the plains, she wrestled with the weight of the decision before her. The life she had known was gone, destroyed in a single violent afternoon of raiding and fire. Her father was dead, her home burned, her connections to the white world severed. What exactly would she be giving up by accepting adoption into the Comanche band? Yet accepting meant embracing the culture of the people who had killed her father, who had dragged her away from everything familiar. It meant letting go of the anger and grief she had carried, meant choosing forgiveness and integration over resentment and resistance. It meant admitting that her old life was truly finished, and that her future lay in a direction she had never imagined or desired. But when she thought of Napawat, when she remembered his face lighting up during their conversations, when she recalled the fragile hope growing in his eyes, the decision became clearer. She had the power to help this broken boy heal in ways that had nothing to do with his legs. She had already formed a bond with him, already cared about his well-being. Walking away from that, remaining a perpetual outsider, seemed like a betrayal of something important, something that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. The next morning, Sarah approached Chief Takota and formally accepted his offer. Relief and approval showed clearly on his weathered face, and he immediately began making arrangements for the adoption ceremony. The ritual would take place in 3 days, giving time for proper preparations, and for word to spread through the camp about what was to occur. Those 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Women Sarah had barely spoken to came to her shelter with gifts of clothing, teaching her how to properly wear the traditional Comanche dress, showing her how to arrange her hair in the style of their people. They spoke to her more openly now, their earlier coldness thawing into cautious welcome. She was no longer an outsider they must tolerate, but someone choosing to become one of them, which carried its own form of honor. Napawat was overjoyed when he learned of Sarah's decision. He spoke rapidly and excitedly about all the things he wanted to teach her, all the stories he wanted to share, all the customs and traditions she needed to learn. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Sarah found herself genuinely looking forward to her new life, despite the strangeness of it all. The adoption ceremony took place on a clear, cold morning. The entire band gathered in a circle around the central fire, dressed in their finest clothing. Chief Takota stood at the center, wearing ceremonial regalia that marked his status and authority. Sarah stood beside him, wearing the traditional dress the women had given her, her blonde hair arranged in braids adorned with beads and feathers. The ceremony was conducted primarily in Comanche, with one of the elders speaking the ritual words. Sarah understood enough to follow the general meaning. She was being declared the sister of Takota's late wife Nadua, who had died from illness 2 years prior. This made Sarah part of the chief's family, gave her a place and identity within the tribal structure, transformed her from outsider to insider through the power of words and communal witness. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Takota placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder and spoke her new name, the name she would carry as a member of the Comanche people. He called her Tukatu, meaning open heart, a recognition of the compassion she had shown in saving Napawat. The assembled tribe repeated the name, accepting her into their community, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face at the unexpected emotion of the moment. After the ceremony, there was feasting and celebration. Sarah found herself surrounded by women who now treated her as one of their own, sharing food and laughter, teaching her songs and customs. Children who had previously ignored her now approached with curiosity and acceptance. Warriors who had viewed her with suspicion or indifference now nodded respectfully when they passed. Everything had changed, and it had happened so quickly that Sarah's head spun with the transformation. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Takota invited Sarah to share a meal in his lodge with himself and Napawat. It was the first time the three of them had sat together as a family, and the significance of the moment was not lost on any of them. They ate buffalo stew and cornmeal cakes, and Napawat talked excitedly about a story he wanted to tell Sarah about one of their ancestors. As Sarah listened to the boys' animated storytelling, she caught Takota watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was a look of appreciation and something deeper, something warmer. She felt her face flush and looked away, confused by her own reaction. The chief was perhaps 15 years her senior, a leader of his people, someone from a completely different world. Yet there was something in his quiet strength, in his obvious love for his son, in his willingness to admit his mistakes and change his thinking, that she found unexpectedly compelling. The weeks following the adoption ceremony settled into a new rhythm. Sarah's days were now divided between learning traditional women's skills from the other members of the band and spending time with Napawat, continuing to work on language lessons and simply keeping him company. She learned to tan hides properly, to create intricate beadwork, to prepare food in the Comanche style. Her hands, once soft from her previous life, became calloused and capable, but it was her time with Napawat that remained the heart of her days. The boy continued to improve emotionally and mentally, his depression lifting as he found purpose in teaching Sarah about his culture and history. He told her stories of great Comanche warriors, of battles won and lost, of the sacred relationship between the people and the land. He taught her the names of plants and animals, explained the spiritual beliefs that guided his people's understanding of the world. Sarah, in turn, began teaching Napawat skills that did not require the use of his legs. She showed him how to work leather into intricate patterns, how to create detailed drawings using natural pigments, how to weave small baskets from reeds gathered at the creek. These were not traditional masculine pursuits in Comanche culture, but Napawat approached them with determination, grateful for any way to feel productive and useful. Chief Takota observed all of this with growing admiration. He saw his son transforming from a hopeless, withdrawn shell into an engaged, purposeful young man. He saw Sarah's patience and creativity in finding ways for Napawat to contribute despite his limitations, and he found himself drawn to her in ways that went beyond gratitude for what she had done for his son. Sarah was unlike any woman he had known. She possessed a strength that was not loud or aggressive, but quiet and enduring. She faced hardship without complaint, adapted to new circumstances with remarkable flexibility, and treated his son with genuine affection rather than pity or obligation. Her smile, which came more frequently now as she settled into her new life, had a brightness that seemed to illuminate the space around her. He began finding excuses to spend more time in the lodge when she was there with Napawat. He would work on various tasks, ostensibly focused on his own activities, but really he was listening to her voice, watching how she moved, observing the gentle way she interacted with his son. He found himself thinking about her during council meetings, during hunts, during the quiet hours of early morning when the camp still slept. Sarah became increasingly aware of the chief's attention, and her own feelings grew more complicated and confused. She had not expected to develop any affection for the Comanche people, much less for their leader. Yet Takota's quiet dignity, his obvious devotion to his son, his willingness to acknowledge his own failures and grow from them, all of this created a portrait of a man worth respecting and perhaps even worth loving. One crisp winter afternoon, Takota asked Sarah to walk with him. They left Napawat working on a detailed drawing he had started, the boy so absorbed in his task that he barely noticed their departure. Takota led Sarah to a rise overlooking the camp, where they could see the entire spread of lodges and the vast prairie beyond. They stood in silence for a moment, watching an eagle circle overhead. Then Takota began to speak, his words careful and deliberate. He told Sarah that he had been alone since his wife's death, that he had buried himself in his duties as chief and in his grief over his son's condition. He said that she had awakened something in him that he thought had died with Nadua, a capacity for hope and connection that he had forgotten he possessed. He said that he knew she had not chosen to come to their people, that tragedy and violence had brought her to them. He could not undo what had happened or restore what she had lost, but he could offer her a future if she wanted it, a future with him and with Napawat, a future as his wife and the mother figure his son desperately needed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A marriage proposal was not something she had anticipated, though perhaps she should have seen it coming. In Comanche culture, a widower chief would be expected to remarry, and her adoption into his late wife's family line actually made such a union appropriate and even logical. But the proposal was not just political or practical. She could hear in Takota's voice, could see in his eyes, that his feelings for her were genuine and deep. She asked for time to consider, and again he granted it without hesitation. That night, Sarah lay awake wrestling with this new decision. Marriage to Takota would cement her place in the tribe, would give her security and status, would allow her to continue helping Napawat. But it would also mean fully committing to this life, to this culture, to this man. There would be no possibility of ever returning to white society, no chance of reconnecting with whatever remained of her former world. Yet as she thought about it, she realized that her former world was already gone. She had no family left in white society, no home to return to, no real prospects even if she somehow escaped and made it back to a settlement. Here, with the Comanche, she had found unexpected purpose. She had saved a boy's life and was helping him rebuild his shattered sense of self. She had earned the respect of a community that had initially viewed her as nothing more than property. And she had the opportunity to share her life with a man who, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds, had shown himself to be honorable, wise, and capable of deep feeling. The next morning, Sarah gave Takota her answer. She would marry him. The chief's face transformed with a smile of pure joy, and he took her hands in his, a gesture of tenderness that made her heart race. They would wait until spring for the wedding, he said, giving her time to fully learn the customs and traditions, giving the tribe time to prepare a celebration worthy of their chief taking a new wife. When Napawat learned of the impending marriage, his reaction was unrestrained delight. He threw his arms around Sarah, thanking her repeatedly for agreeing to truly become part of their family. His happiness was so genuine, so pure, that any lingering doubt Sarah harbored melted away. This was right, unconventional, unexpected, born from tragedy and loss, but right nonetheless. The winter months passed with a kind of quiet contentment Sarah had never known. She divided her time between learning the skills and knowledge she would need as the chief's wife and continuing to work with Napawat. The boy's transformation continued to amaze everyone in the tribe. Though his legs remained useless, his spirit had fully returned to life. He became known as a storyteller and artist, creating intricate drawings that depicted tribal history and legends. Takota courted Sarah with a gentle patience that surprised and touched her. He brought her small gifts, things he had made or traded for specifically with her in mind. A beautifully crafted knife with a handle wrapped in soft leather, a warm buffalo robe decorated with intricate quill work, beads in colors he had noticed she favored. Each gift came with few words but deep meaning, building a foundation of care and consideration between them. They spent long evenings in his lodge, sometimes with Napawat and sometimes alone, talking about their lives, their beliefs, their hopes for the future. Sarah told Takota about her childhood, about growing up on the Texas frontier, about her parents and the dreams they had held. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he truly wanted to understand where she had come from and who she had been. Takota, in turn, shared stories of his own life. He told her about his youth as a warrior, about the battles he had fought to protect his people, about the difficult decisions he had made as chief. He spoke about his late wife Nadua with affection and respect, but without the crushing grief that had characterized his earlier mourning. Sarah's presence had helped him move forward, had shown him that honoring the past did not require remaining trapped in it. As they talked and shared, Sarah found herself falling in love with this man who had once been her captor, but had become so much more. She loved his wisdom and his strength, his devotion to his people and his son, his capacity for change and growth. She loved the way he looked at her, as if she were precious beyond measure. She loved how his rare smiles transformed his usually serious face into something almost boyish. The approach of spring brought preparations for the wedding. The women of the tribe took charge of creating Sarah's ceremonial dress, a magnificent garment of soft deerskin decorated with elaborate beadwork and fringe. They taught her the songs she would need to sing, the steps she would need to take, the words she would need to say. Their instruction was patient and thorough, ensuring that Sarah would honor the traditions properly. Napawat worked tirelessly on a special gift for Sarah and his father, a large hide painting depicting their story from her capture, through her heroic rescue of him from the fire to the present moment. The work was remarkably detailed and emotionally powerful, showing not just events but feelings, capturing the journey they had all taken from tragedy toward healing and hope. The wedding took place on a warm day in early spring, when the prairie grasses were just beginning to green and wildflowers dotted the landscape with color. The entire band gathered, along with members of neighboring Comanche groups who had traveled to witness their chief's marriage. Sarah had never seen so many people assembled in one place, and the magnitude of the occasion made her nervous, until Takota took her hand and squeezed it gently, grounding her in the moment. The ceremony was complex and beautiful, involving rituals that symbolized the joining of two lives into one. Sarah and Takota exchanged gifts, shared food from the same bowl, wrapped themselves together in a single blanket to represent their future unity. Elders spoke blessings over them, and the assembled people sang songs that had been sung at Comanche weddings for generations beyond counting. When the ritual concluded, and they were declared husband and wife, Takota kissed Sarah gently, a gesture borrowed from white culture but meaningful nonetheless. The crowd erupted in celebration, and the festivities began in earnest. There was feasting and dancing, storytelling and games, laughter and joy that lasted well into the night. Through it all, Sarah felt a sense of belonging and rightness that she had not known was possible. These people who had once been her captors were now her family. This man who had once been her jailer was now her husband. This life that had seemed like a nightmare had transformed into something precious and worth celebrating. The journey from one reality to the other had been neither simple nor easy, but standing there in the midst of the celebration, Sarah knew she had found her place in the world. The days following the wedding settled into a new pattern. Sarah moved into Takota's lodge permanently, and the three of them, chief, wife, and son, formed a family unit that felt natural and right. Napawat delighted in having Sarah as his stepmother, and the bond between them deepened even further. Takota proved to be an attentive and affectionate husband, treating Sarah with respect and tenderness that made her grateful every day for her decision to accept his proposal. As spring progressed into summer, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news brought tears of joy from both Takota and Napawat. The chief held her gently, as if she might break, whispering words of love and gratitude in Comanche. Napawat immediately began planning all the things he would teach his future sibling, excited at the prospect of being an older brother. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Sarah's belly grew round with new life. The women of the tribe treated her with special care, ensuring she did not overwork herself, sharing remedies for the minor discomforts of pregnancy, telling her stories of their own experiences of childbirth. She felt supported and loved in a way that would have seemed impossible during those first terrifying weeks of captivity. One warm afternoon, as Sarah sat outside the lodge working on a small cradle board for the coming baby, Napawat approached her with an excited expression. He had been practicing something in secret, he said, and wanted to show her. Sarah set aside her work and gave him her full attention. To her absolute shock, Napawat began to pull himself forward using not just his arms but also his legs. The movement was awkward and clearly required tremendous effort, but his legs were moving, actually responding to his commands. He explained in a rush of words that he had been working on this for months, exercising his legs in ways Sarah had suggested based on stories her mother had told about a man who had regained some function after an injury. The progress was minimal, nowhere near enough for him to walk or ride, but it was progress nonetheless. More importantly, Napawat had found purpose and hope in the effort. He was no longer defined entirely by what he could not do, but also by what he was working toward, by the possibility of improvement, however small. Sarah embraced him, tears streaming down her face, proud beyond words of his determination and courage. Takota emerged from the lodge drawn by the commotion, and Napawat demonstrated his newfound ability for his father. The chief watched with an expression of wonder, then knelt beside his son and pulled him into a fierce embrace. He thanked Sarah, his voice thick with emotion, for giving his son back his hope, for helping him see possibilities rather than only limitations. As summer waned toward autumn, Sarah gave birth to a healthy daughter. The labor was long and difficult, but she was surrounded by experienced women who guided her through it with competence and care. When she finally held her baby girl for the first time, looking down at the tiny face with its mixture of her own features and Takota's, she felt a completeness she had not known was missing. They named the baby Kunu, meaning harvest, because she had been born during the season of plenty, and because she represented the fruition of the unexpected seeds that had been planted when Sarah first saved Napawat from the fire. The baby was welcomed into the tribe with celebration, and Napawat took his role as older brother with utmost seriousness, always wanting to hold her, to tell her stories, to be involved in her care. The seasons turned, and life in the Comanche camp continued its rhythms. Sarah's daughter grew, learning to smile and laugh, reaching for the world with curious hands. Napawat continued his exercises and his art, becoming known throughout the region for his remarkable drawings. Takota led his people with wisdom and strength, always consulting with Sarah on important decisions, valuing her perspective and insight. On a crisp autumn evening, nearly 2 years after the fire that had changed everything, Sarah sat outside the lodge watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Takota sat beside her, their daughter sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. Napawat was inside the lodge, working on a new drawing by firelight. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about the violence and loss that had seemed to destroy her world, about the choices she had made, and the unexpected paths those choices had opened. She thought about the person she had been, and the person she had become, about the family she had lost and the family she had found. Takota reached over and took her free hand in his, lacing their fingers together. He did not speak, did not need to. The gesture said everything, communicated a depth of love and gratitude and partnership that transcended language. Sarah squeezed his hand back, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of his presence. She had been captured, yes, but she had also been freed. Freed from a life that had been destroyed beyond recovery. Freed from grief that might have consumed her. Freed to discover strength and purpose and love in the most unexpected of places. She had saved a boy from fire, and in doing so, she had saved herself from a different kind of burning, the slow, consuming flame of hopelessness and despair. The last light of day faded from the sky, and stars began to appear overhead. Countless points of light in the vast darkness. Sarah held her daughter close, felt her husband's hand in hers, heard her stepson's voice calling from inside the lodge with a question about his drawing. This was her life now, her family, her home, and it was, against all odds and expectations, exactly where she belonged.